you know what, I'm only going to get like 3/4 of this. And instead, I'm sitting there and it's just all sort of coming together. I don't know.
You know what?
Maybe it was from like the article that we read last week that's probably helping too.
Yeah, and I read a little more past that too. I guess for me, recognizing how anti-reductionist Hegel is too has helped a lot, which is why we're building from the most abstract up. Kind of implies, I don't know. I think that's kind of why we end up going that direction in some form, because he wants to not reduce to something, so it necessarily means you build up.
Yep. Instead of from the top down.
Yeah.
Top down always feels like an incomplete picture, which, I mean, makes perfect sense, you know. You're always going to leave something out if you assume what you're meant to prove in the first place. If that makes any sense. Okay, so we started at the transition point, and I'm just going to start us off by reading a couple of things from the transition to physics to try to get together what we were talking about. Okay, so it says the substance of matter, gravity, developed into the totality of form, no longer has the self externality of matter outside it. So basically, he's saying that matter uh, is being shown to be self contained rather than what makes it up is just sort of each point outside uh, each other. Because that's where we begin in the immediate sense at the beginning of the mechanics is that everything that's there is just sort of self-external. Everything is outside of each other and not touching. And now we find that matter is actually this totality made up of this. Uh, and then he says its abstract torpid being within self as simply heavy has resolved itself into form. It is qualified matter, the sphere of physics. Um, and he starts talking about, let's see what he says here. In motion, bodies exist only as points. What gravity determines is only the spatial interrelationships of points. The unity of matter is only a unity of the place it seeks, not a concrete one, a self. That is the nature of the sphere, and the externality of the determining of matter constitutes the peculiar determinateness of matter. And then he says something that is going to sound really like cosmic, I guess you could say, to a lot of our viewers and to me a little as well. He says, what the solar system is as a whole, matter is now to be in detail. And like I said last time, he I think the idea of the large and the small being basically dealing with the same thing comes out here really well. We can see in macro what exists in micro. In other words, what matter is in its being. He says it's the same, and it is, right? But it's hard to see from our vantage point, looking at the big and looking at the small, the connection based just on empirical knowledge. But when you start to uh, get it together in this sense, you know, it becomes pretty obvious, I think. He says, in other words, the solar system as self-moving is the sublating of the merely ideal being for self, of the mere spatiality of the determination, i.e., of the non-being for self. In the notion, the negation of place is not, again, only a determining a place. On the contrary, the negation of the non-being for itself is a negation of the negation in affirmation, and thus there emerges real being for itself, real matter. That is, the determinations of form which constitute the solar system are the determinations of matter itself, and they constitute the being of matter. And then he talks about how the realization of this is the transition from mechanics to actual physics. And I mean,
This would be like the chemism section in logic, effectively the same thing, because it's the interrelationship of things now, not merely external.
yeah, not merely self-external. Exactly. Um, and leading into this, he um, hang on. So yeah, I guess yeah, just leading out of the transition, what results, he says in the Zusatz right here, the determinations of the notion now receive materiality. The being for self of matter finds its point of unity. And so, and so, yeah. And so we're at a more substantial, uh, um, I guess, way of being. Jim, if you
Yeah.
could read number 272 in full, just the top part.
Okay. Matter has individuality insofar as it has being for self developed within itself and is therefore determined within itself. Matter thus wrests itself from gravity, manifests itself, and determines itself within itself. Previously, the spatial element it was determined by gravity, that is, by a center other than matter itself, a center which matter only sought, but now, by virtue of the form immanent in it, matter develops the spatial element out of itself and in opposition to gravity.
Thanks. Yeah, that's um, so matter is less abstractly universal at this point and has more of an individuality that embodies that universality. Although I'm not sure if we're there to be able to say that necessarily yet in full. Um, he says gravity is the inward essence of matter. Its merely inner identity passes over, since its notion is essential outwardness, into the manifestation of this essence. So it passes from the outer to the inner of matter. And I just want to remind you guys, whenever you feel like going back into the logic just for a read and you're thinking about what the inner and the outer is and what it means, this is a really great application because you can see that because matter itself, depending on, well, any mass that matter has generates gravity, right? And so you can see how Hegel's language translates this phenomenon, and you can apply that language in other instances and get a better feel for its meaning. So when he says that the gravity is the um, gravity passes over, yeah, uh, into the manifestation of this essence of matter from an outward position, right? Before it was what matter chases for its center, and now we find that it is actually what is generated by the center of matter, I guess you could say. As such, it is the totality of the determinations of a reflection, but these as cast asunder, so that each appears as a particular qualified matter, which is not yet determined to individuality as a formless element. And so we get this idea of gravity itself as this. Well, it's more of a matter than something solid. You know what I mean? It's um, it's a formless element, like you said. Yeah. And this I think is really kind of helpful here below because he says these materialized form determinations exist in two ways, once as immediate and again as posited. In the solar system, they appear as immediate existences and again as essentially posited. Um, the former is generated intrinsically in the notion, but this must also be posited. So this reality distinguishes itself as a particular mode of existence. And I'm not totally clear, but I think what he's talking about is how we think about things and thought about the universe as well as what occurs to us quite immediately through the senses about the universe. Does that seem to track? Or am I reading that wrong?
Do it again. Sorry, just trying to think about it.
Okay. Um, so he says that the materialized form determinations exist in two ways, once as immediate and again as posited. In the solar system, they appear as immediate existences and again as essentially posited, right? Just as parents have an immediate existence, but exist also as children, as offspring. Light exists, therefore, once as the sun and also as the product of external conditions. So you have the generator of light and you have light itself. And how do you
Right.
talk about light when it's so abstract? Like you're not even talking about the photons at this point, as in just regular science. You're talking about what light is and whether light exists as matter, uh, quite apart from what it illuminates, right? And also what generated the light.
You
So
gotta
never mind. My initial like one is thought and one is real life. It,
oh,
that's
kind
yeah.
of. It's like one's a universal and one's a particular, right? The notion's more universal, while the external conditions are more particular.
Daddy, point.
It's kind of like
Neat, hun.
we know what light is in itself, and there's different ways it can be generated, but different ways doesn't mean that the light's not light. It doesn't make a difference.
No, honey, it's time for bed.
It's time for bed?
Yeah, it's time for bed. You want some milk?
Yeah.
And
It's,
all right, milk.
I am curious. I think about
Tomorrow?
six.
Huh?
Tomorrow?
I don't know.
We go up there.
The formers are intrinsically in the notion. This reality distinguishes itself as a particular mode of existence.
So yeah, at first I was thinking the word posited I think is throwing me off in this section because I'm thinking, okay, there's reality and then there's our thoughts about reality. But then he goes on later in this section, he says light exists, therefore once as the sun and also as the product of external conditions. So basically, you have light, which is the photons, and then you have the sun, which releases the photons, right? Although we're not talking about photons necessarily, we're just talking about light
Because
more.
here, the main source of light you would think of in existence, which is why I think he later talks about sun as the individual concept, is just the main source of light.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah. So he gets into this and he says, just for our audience, he says physics has for its content the universal individuality, which is the immediate free physical qualities, right? Um, and the qualities are quite exist on their own. The particular individuality, the relation of form as a physical determination to gravity and the determination of gravity by this form, and then see the total free individuality. Okay. So I pretty much got how mechanics brought together into a unity um, constitutes what matter is able to do, and that looking at these elements separately makes it look like reality is made up of matter that's all self-external not connected in any way. And now we find that actually matter is all of that stuff in a unity. So yeah, and now we're looking at that unity in its, of course, immediate sense, and then finding its essentiality. He says this part is the most difficult in nature, for it embraces finite corporeality. The sphere of differences always presents the greatest difficulty because the notion is no longer present in immediate fashion as in the first part, mechanics, nor has it shown itself as real as in the third part, organics. Here the notion is concealed. It shows itself only as the connecting bond of necessity, while what is manifest is notionless. In the first part, differences of form are unconnected and mutually independent. That seems to make sense. In the second, individuality is in a state of difference, of opposition. It is only in the third part that individuality is mistress over difference of form. Yeah. So, Kyle, read 274.
Physical qualities exist first as immediate, as separate and self-subsistent existences, the now physical determined celestial bodies. Secondly, as related to the individual unity of their totality, the physical elements. Thirdly, as the process which engenders what is individual in those elements, the meteorological process.
All right. And we've been through this before, this section before, but I feel like I understand it a little bit better. So we'll just go through some of these, and then we can talk about them. So he says the free physical body is the determinations of the notion now receive materiality. The being for self of matter finds its point of unity. We enter logically into the sphere of essence. Essence is returned to self in one's other, reflection of determinations in one another, which, as thus reflected into self, now develop as forms. And he goes through the essential forms: identity, difference, opposition, ground. That is to say, matter leaves its first immediacy behind, where space and time, matter and motion passed over into each other. Same language as in the doctrine of being, by the way. Until finally, in free mechanics, matter appropriated the determinations as its own and thus revealed itself as self-mediating and self-determining. In other words, matter has, again, same language as the doctrine of essence, has those properties, those qualities, which is exactly what he says up here, the free, immediate free physical qualities. So that's where we are in the immediate sphere. Thrust, for example, is no longer external to matter. On the contrary, matter's differentiation is its internal immanent thrust, and so on and so forth. These are material qualities which belong to the substance of matter. What matter is, it is only through its qualities. And so again, reading back into the logic, we can start to make sense of some of this language when applied to thought, right? The substance of thought is made up of the qualities that had gone before that point, if that makes sense. In the first sphere, mechanics, the determinations are still divorced from the substance. They are not material determinations, which is funny to say, but when you're talking about space, time, place, and those things, you think of them as hard concrete determinations, but really they're aspects, they're qualities of the real things that they apply to, is what he's getting at. Let's see. So he goes into light. I'm going to read 275 because we're chugging along here, and I think we're going to make this make sense. Matter in its first qualified state is pure identity with itself, unity of reflection into self, and hence the first, still quite abstract manifestation. As existent in nature, in other words, exists in nature. It is the reference to itself as independent in face of the other determinations of the totality. This existent, universal self of matter is light. As an individuality, it is a star. As a star, which is a moment of a totality, it is the sun. And so he's sort of delineating down what light consists of. So light is the universal, the individuality is the star. Is a star which is a moment of a totality is the sun.
Yeah, I think that's why I took it as like the individual aspect we recognized at the time at his time. Today, that's light's a lot more universal than that with
Yeah.
artificial lighting.
Well,
Yeah.
light is like the light could almost be in this sense as a universal and umbrella term that includes the star, includes the sun, and our ability to relate ourselves to our own sun is much more is the closest, I guess you could say, whereas the star as an individuality, there are also well, I mean, it is a star, yeah, and the sun is our particular like sun. I'm unsure how to parse that syllogism, whether it's the one way or the other. Um, but I at least get that the universal extreme of the syllogism is light. It's the big umbrella term. Okay. So he says light is this pure existent force of space filling. Its being is absolute velocity, pure materiality, which is everywhere present, real existence, which remains within itself, or actuality as a transparent possibility. He says light is only present in space and then not as something individual. So light is everywhere. You can see light from any corner of the galaxy, either from an individual star or a very close sun, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes into the logical language here. Not all of it I completely get, but you know, he says it enters into community with all and yet abides in itself. So what he's talking about here is that light illuminates all other matter that's not light, right? But it also abides in itself as light, right? So in our modern sense, we can differentiate between, say, the illuminated planet and the photons that did it, that abide in themselves, just as separate from the illumination itself, I guess you could say.
I was kind of thinking, kind of like in the being for itself, in this sense. This is not yet understood in its time that, light is an electromagnetic, excitation, right? So electricity generates magnetism, blah, blah, blah. It's entirely self-encompassing, right?
Yeah.
That's also kind of a little bit interesting, metaphysically derived also that's implicit in here. But I guess it's in chemism, so that would be why. Or in physics section.
Yeah, and
It's always-
also remember when he talks about light like that, he's
Yeah,
not necessarily talking about the physical process itself,
right.
but how
I'm
we, yeah,
talking about the alignment of it kind
yeah,
of working out still.
yeah. Yeah, I still get cross-eyed reading some of these things because um because sometimes he mixes his discussion of the metaphysical light and the actual physical reality that is light that can be measured, can be seen, can be scientifically written down by the understanding, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
Which again, like we talked about in the very beginning, and especially with the article last week, Houlgate maintains that Hegel is, has this parallel where the logical natural categories are uh, logically derived, but then they're matched up with their real world counterpart, and so on and so forth. We talked about that. He says this manifestation is to be grasped in its first determinateness. As such, it is the wholly universal manifestation, as yet devoid of any determination within itself. So, yeah. And then I love this because he goes into the parallel in the science of spirit. He says that light is like the ego, at the level of the science of spirit. Like light, the ego is pure self-manifestation, only it is at the same time the infinite negativity of the return to itself out of itself as object, and it's hence the infinite point of subjective individuality of the exclusion of another. Because, therefore, light lacks the infinitude of the return into itself, light is not self-consciousness. It is only the manifestation of itself, not for itself, but for another. Light illuminates, basically. Whereas in the ego, thought illuminates itself and so returns to itself in its infinitude. And this is one of those instances in which Hegel, in order to better explain what he's talking about with a subject, is he goes up to a more concrete point on the dialectic in order to reveal its more abstract structure, if that makes sense. Light is a very abstract structure, and so he's trying to show you the parallel that's more concrete in order to better illuminate the more abstract point, is what I'm trying to get at. And I think this is a really good technique. I also think that if you haven't read all the way through to the end of the spirit, it can probably be confusing, but really all he means to do is just say, this is at the same essential level as the ego, and what the ego does within self-consciousness. And he just gives the short summary of what ego does as self-consciousness. And then he says, for this reason, this abstract manifestation is secondly also spatial, an absolute expansion in space, and not the taking back of this expansion into the unifying point of infinite subjectivity. So light, it's like it's like the cogwheel from the Empire, or maybe that's the Sith. I think it's the Sith emblem, because it has a center and then it has arrows going out in every direction, right? Within thought, those arrows would bounce off and go back into the center to constitute reflection into itself. Light is infinite spatial dispersion, or rather, it is an infinite generation of space, right? So before, we thought of space as this sort of like infinite expanse that's completely wholly indeterminate. But now we see that light, in its infinite spatial dispersion, generates space that's far more concrete than the previous position, I guess you could say, position of space, if that makes sense. Now, since in nature the determinations as sundered fall outside one another, this pure manifestation also exists separately, but as an untrue existence. Okay. Then he says, thirdly, light must arrive at its limit. However, this necessity of encountering an other differs from the absolute limitation of being for self, in virtue of which matter offers resistance. As abstract identity, light has difference outside it as the not of light. This is constituted by the other reflected determinations of essence, existing as physical corporealities. As the universal principle of making manifest, light is the first satisfaction. Light is the beginning of material manifestation, is excellent only in the sense of an abstraction. Because of this abstraction, light has a limit, a defect or lack, and it is only through its limit that it manifests itself. It is first in the limit that the moment of negation, and therefore of determination, is found, and it is in the limit that reality first begins. Since only the concrete is true, existence demands not only the one abstract element, but also the other. So he's talking about the essence of essentiality, I guess you could say, the opposites that actually interpenetrate each other, as shown in the doctrine of essence, right? And so, applied to light, light also has to uh, be shown against darkness as an opposite, but also, as part of a continuum.
I think it's kind of funny because Hegel uses this as a metaphor early in the logic, but here it's like literal because we're talking about light itself.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It is only after light has distinguished itself as light as against darkness that it manifests itself as light. And then he goes, I mean, it's exactly like the discussion in the logic. He goes back to the, you know, uh he goes back to the whole how does he put it? Um like if you're a blind man and you're uh I wish I had the quote in front of me. But basically if you were looking and everything was light, you wouldn't see anything at all. Is one of the things he says.
And the logic.
Yeah, like if you're in a room that's all light and you can see, you can't see anything because it's all just light, right? Um, but if you're, yeah, I can't remember the rest of it.
I guess it does prove that differentiation is important because,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. And then he goes into the logical structure of the reality of light. And he asks the questions: how is visibility made visible? How is this process of manifestation itself made manifest? Manifestation demands a subject, and the question is how this subject exists. And it talks about, I think he's starting to talk about the star slash the sun and how it is a self luminous body and how it generates light. I don't want to say scientifically it generates light, but but maybe that is. I don't know. Yeah, he says this fact is empirically ascertained. Let's see here. Sorry. Light constitutes the real existence or the physical import of the body of abstract centrality, which real existence is in the form of a luminous body. This is the sun, the self-luminous body. This fact is empirically ascertained. You look up in the sky and there it is, right? And at first it is all we have to say about the sun. There it is. This body is the primordial, uncreated light, which does not arise from the conditions of finite existence, but immediately is. Metaphysically, uh, to say. The stars also are self-luminous bodies, their existence constituted by the physical abstraction of light. Um, and they stay at the level of abstraction basically because, you know, yeah. Oh dear. Please no. I hate that man. And every day it just gets worse and worse.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and he talks about the metaphysics dealing with the sun and stars and how there's you jump right from it's real to you can put things like men and animals and plants on the sun and the moon and such, but that's a leap of logic in itself. He says only a planet can give rise to these things. um
I think
yeah,
this actually
yeah.
talks about we don't know much about the stars right now, basically, is what this one section says.
Yeah, and metaphysically, we can only say very limited things about those bodies, basically by what they provide and by what they end up being in and of themselves. Um, yeah, and again, this is a very it's still a very abstract section, but it deals more with um, individuality, I guess you could say. Um, oh, I like this. The physical conditions of the solar light do not concern us in as much as they are not determinations of the notion, but only matters of empirical fact. And this, I think, is a really important statement because he's separating out what science can gather about the material world and what we can make of them as metaphysics shows their logical connection. Yes, just one moment. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
All right, sorry about that. Just regular parent stuff going on there. Yeah. So, like I was saying, this uh, the physical conditions of the solar light do not concern us inasmuch as they are not determinations of the notion, but only matters of empirical facts. So he's again drawing the distinction between uh, what there is that the understanding gathers and what metaphysically we can derive in a logical sense. And that's a key distinction throughout the system of logic. And he starts to go into some of the details. He says the mechanical origin of the solar light is to be sought in the axial rotation of the sun because this is abstract reference to self. Insofar as light must be physically produced, we can say that all bodies belonging to the solar system produce a center and make a luminous body for themselves. Neither of these two moments is without the other, but the one involves the other. So again, the dialectical involvement within the solar system of the sun and the planets, I think is what he's getting at. And he says at the very end here, it's very interesting. The sun is the process of the entire solar system which bursts forth in this point of light. Interesting. And he rounds it up here. I mean, we were only going to read up to page 91, but he rounds it up on this point, saying the abstract self of matter, light, is absolutely weightless, and as matter, it is an infinite self externality. But as pure making manifest, as material ideality, it is inseparable and simple self externality. And that's it. That's where we ended up. There's oh, take yourself off mute, Kyle.
So it hit me earlier to kind of realize why this sort of kind of conception. I was thinking about this conception of electromagnetic kind of being in itself, kind of in for itself, related to each other. We're getting past mechanics, and light can't be defined by mechanics, so it necessarily has that feature. Period. So,
Yeah,
so that makes sense. It's just it's non-mechanical, so it has to have some sort of interrelationship with its components.
yeah, yeah, and that um,
I just find it kind of funny. It fits here about the exact same point space and time did in mechanics in the way that electromagnetism do have an interrelationship, even though at best you could say it's implicit here because if we take into account what light actually ends up being only.
right,
That
and
it
sorry, go
that
ahead, go
was
ahead.
like a coincidence I thought was interesting that I wasn't sure if it was real at first, so but it's not.
Yeah, I am. I'm still puzzling through exactly how it works to think about these different elements of nature, especially light,
Mhm.
in terms of the metaphysics, because
Yeah,
metaphysics is absolutely not the historical material view which shows history and materiality giving birth to the universe and all of its
right.
empirical processes and laws, which science proper, as Hegel understands it through the understanding, looks at the universe and finds an order in it. The metaphysics is able to show us the logical necessity that orders
I think that is
See,
It is
I'm not a complete thought on this yet.
it is the first negation of qualified matter, right? And of course, by being the first determinant as it's a negation, it's massless here, right? Or weightless here. Mass
Yeah, yeah.
weight. Or it's massless, because weightless is massless. Well, massless is inherently weightless. So I think that's starting to connect it for me there. I'm just trying to think how we get qualified to light itself. I guess I need to go back through that again, but
Um, so qualified matter in its most
oh,
abstract state
because
starts with light.
it does follow through like similarly to space, because space starts out as an amorphous extension that turns into negation of extension. Initially, it's first determinants. So I
Yeah.
think that might be the same path we're doing here.
Yeah.
An amorphous qualitative matter, light, and then in its first determinacy is itself weightless. Yep. That's all it is.
Just watch the flash, John.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, elsewhere he talked about heavy matter that
Yeah,
has mass or weight,
it's like the
and
negation.
whereas light
Yeah.
is
Right.
it's a form of matter, but it is weightless.
Yeah, I think it comes next, is it comes weightless first, and then it gets dark as the negation of negation. Or just double negation, I'm not sure which. And then what does heavy matter translate into next? Bodies of opposition. That's where darkness shows up.
Okay, I'm back. Um, mm, sorry. 277. So light goes on for quite a bit.
Until, yeah, I think one of these sections he goes deeply
Yeah.
into. No, he doesn't actually.
So my suggestion is that we go from 91 to 99. Um, basically finish light in terms of, well, whatever number one was, which was, what was it?
91's where we stopped, so
Yeah. So 91 to 99, it basically finishes up one light.
right.
And we finish out the definition of light in total, which I guess I would have assigned last time, but there's a lot to it to get from the transition into what the physics is supposed to be, which is the essential section of the philosophy of nature, and just being able to get that under your belt, like what it means, as well as sort of light in its immediacy. It's a lot to start with. And now that we're actually getting into the full definition of light, what I suggest is we read 91 through 99 and then reference Hoolgate's article in which, hang on just a second, there's a section in this article which I didn't really get to in
It's
our,
the second last section, right?
yeah, it is. So it's 9.6, the problem of light. And so once we have light under our belt, then we can reference this last. So yeah, read 91 through 99 in the philosophy of nature, and then read Hegel's Philosophy of Nature, a critical guide, the Cambridge Critical Guide. Hoolgate's article 9.6, the problem of light. You have it too, Jim, right? The
Yeah.
in PDF, yeah. And then we can discuss light in its full definition alongside Hoolgate's comments, and that'll make for a pretty good discussion, I think. Any parting thoughts on how all this is working out? I think I think it's going pretty well.
Yeah, I think going through phenomenology, I've played around with the being in itself and being for other between subject and object that I see that much better now and even in this, which has helped a lot.
Yeah, really has. Awesome, comrades. All right, well, it's 8:57, and we've I think we parked it. You guys have a good week, and we'll continue to talk about light over the DMs, and have a good one.
You too.
You too.
Jim,
Yep.
Cal.